Hi, everybody, and welcome to a special episode of Safer Journeys, a Safe Journeys podcast. I am your host, Grace McCormick, and I'm so excited to be here with our special guest today, Katherine McLaughlin from Elevatus. How are you doing, Katherine?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm excited that you're here. I had the opportunity to take your training back in, I believe it was July, and I learned a lot, so I'm really excited that we can now share your knowledge with our listeners too. So would you do me a favor and tell us a little bit about what Elevatus is, what your role is in it, excuse me, and how you wound up a part of it?
Yeah, well, I actually am the founder of Elevatus Training, and I'm the CEO and the lead trainer. And really, what we do is we provide training and education tools for people to address sexuality and healthy relationships for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So I've been a sexuality educator for over 30 years, and a lot of special educators started to reach out and developmental disability agencies saying, how do we address this topic? And I just started to develop trainings for them, and that's where it all began.
And are you primarily focused just in North America? Because I know you're located in New Hampshire, right? You're a professor. Um,
I
is
am
it
in New
international or just national?
Well, it's somewhat international. How does that sound? So mostly it's national, but for example, we have a 3-day training that we do, and there's over 1,500 people that have attended it, and approximately 100 are from outside of the US.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
What have you learned from like the conception of Elevatus to now? What has Elevatus taught you, even though you
Mm.
founded it, what have you learned along the way?
Oh, lots. So I think the first thing that I learned when I started doing this work in particular is this idea of the self-advocacy movement around nothing about us without us. So I went to work with some self-advocates just to tell them I was going to create materials and all this, and they said, "Hold on, nothing about us without us. We want to be part of creating these materials with you." And we also want to be one of the teachers of these materials as well. So I think that was a sort of my first aha moment around maybe I didn't know everything and that I needed to include the population that I was trying to reach and provide access to sexuality education too. And so the curriculum that I developed with them is designed to be team taught between a self-advocate, a person with an intellectual developmental disability, and a professional. So I've learned that nothing about us without us. I think the other thing that I've learned along the way is people with disabilities are very open to learning about this. They want to learn about this. They're asking to learn about this. But the barriers tend to be those that surround people with disabilities, and they're worried. They don't want people to get hurt and bad things to happen. And so they're worried that education will somehow put people at risk. And it's really the exact opposite. Um, I also think that people are ready to address this topic. Um, I've noticed that over the years. Before, when I first started doing this work, people would say, "Will you come in and lead these classes?" And now agencies and schools are saying, "Okay, we'll do it if you just kind of help us out." Um, so people are ready, and they're not relying on me to come in. They're ready to take this on. Um, and I think, people are changing their mindsets about this and seeing that people with disabilities are sexual beings just like everyone else, and that knowledge is power and knowledge is protection, and ignorance is not bliss. Yeah, so that's what I've noticed.
That's awesome. And I know Elevatus trains not only educators, but parents and professionals on how to teach self-advocacy to individuals with intellectual disabilities. Why is it so important that not only the student is learning, but also the teacher's learning as they're teaching? Why is that so important?
Yeah, well, I think a couple things. One is I also train self-advocates to be sexuality educators. So I think if we're talking about sexual self-advocacy, that the instructor, many of them say with disabilities, when I'm teaching something, I feel like if I don't do this, how can I teach someone else? So it really motivates the instructors to self-advocate as well around relationships. I think if the teacher is a professional, I think it sees people with disabilities in a more positive light. Like, how can I teach this group of students or adults or around how to speak up for your right to be in a relationship, as well as how do you speak up in relationships too. So I think it's a good, there's lots of myths about people with disabilities, and so one might be that they need protection. And when instructors learn, no, actually, I'm going to teach how they can protect themselves versus me protecting them. So I think it tends to empower individuals more when teachers believe in teaching self-advocacy as well.
That's so interesting, especially considered from a statistical viewpoint, people with disabilities are so much more likely to be abused. And I know you explain this really well. So could you do our audience a favor? I know I've heard it and I'm happy to hear it again, but kind of explain why that is.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think first is these myths that people with disabilities don't need this information. So they often lack basic sexuality and healthy relationship education. So that leaves people at risk, just not having any knowledge around what's a healthy relationship, unhealthy. Um, who is it okay to touch my body and who isn't? So I think that's important to make sure people have basic information. So at this point, lots of people with disabilities don't have that. And sometimes they're also taught in a way that isn't cognitively accessible to them. So they may be in a mainstream health class, but they're not getting supplemental information they might need or ways taught in ways that would help them increase their access to education. I think another reason that the rates are so high is that people with disabilities are often taught to comply and do what others tell them to do and please others, be compliant. And so that really puts someone at risk if they're not able to say, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to eat those peas or carrots for dinner. How are they going to be able to advocate for themselves in more emotional situations like sexual relationships? So that trying to please everyone and not thinking of your own feelings first is often taught to people with disabilities. The other thing that puts people at risk is many people, because they're worried and concerned about people with disabilities, they tend to try to restrict and control them. And many people with disabilities say, if someone tries to control or restrict me, I'm going to work around them. And when I work around someone, I'm more risky. And if something negative happens, I don't feel that I can come back to this person because they told me I shouldn't do this already. So it just leaves people really vulnerable around making their own decisions. And don't we want to be part of these conversations rather than trying to control someone, educate, help them think through their decisions, that kind of thing. So I think those are some of the things that put people at risk. Just and those can all be prevented and fixed.
And I think community is a really important aspect to that prevention, right? Like if, maybe you're not able to become Elevatus trained because you don't have the time, or maybe you're not up in the professional field yet, or doesn't have if you don't have a lot of experience and intersection with topics like this, how can you help disabled people advocate for themselves and also be an advocate for them when they're not around?
Uh-huh. Yeah. I mean, I think, I'd love to share some resources with you that you can share with listeners. I think that's a piece is sharing resources, thinking of people with disabilities as sexual beings, just like everyone else. I think that helps too. So just sort of bringing up the topic. In your setting, or if someone says something like, oh, they don't need that, you can say, whoa, hold on a second, everybody needs this information. I think one of the other things that people can also think about is, many people with disabilities are thought of as children even when they're adults, so really thinking of the person as their biological age, and everyone that's 18 needs this information whether they have a disability or not. And so I think not infantilizing people with disabilities, but treating them their age. And especially when they're adults or young adults, really giving them treating them like you would any adult. So I think sharing resources, thinking of them as sexual beings and adults, and bringing up the topic would be my suggestion for someone that maybe can't do a lot of workshops or get trained or something. They can certainly start changing the culture and people's mindsets.
I think that's a really good idea, and I will definitely post all of the resources that you're willing to share in links with
Yeah,
this episode in our bio, and also we'll make them available on our social media. So thank you for that. Um,
sure.
Kind of talking about safe journeys in our organization as a whole, it's built around the idea that healing is a journey and advocacy is a journey too, I think, and it definitely isn't linear, right? So what can you tell us about your journey that you're willing to share, of course, and how it's affected your life and the choices you've made that brought you here? Maybe not necessarily to the Zoom meeting, but kind of where you are
Yeah,
career-wise.
absolutely. Yeah, I think when I think about my journey, I can go way back. I can go back to my mother working with students with intellectual disabilities when I was growing up, and she would train other teachers. So I think about like just being around that in my life, as well as someone in my neighborhood, a young man had an intellectual disability that I played with growing up as well. So sort of like thinking about and getting this message that everyone is a human early on in life. And then, like I said, people started reaching out to me when I was a sexuality educator to help this population. And right around that time, I ended up experiencing an accident and became a wheelchair user. So all of a sudden, I'm in this world uh, tooling around in a wheelchair, and people are treating me totally differently than what they did before. And I'm thinking, well, I'm the same person. I just use this chair. And so just being more aware of disability awareness and disability rights and justice. So I think personally, I got involved. Then people were reaching out, and it just made perfect sense to sort of go down this path. And as things have changed, like I said, people, didn't want to do this work. They wanted me to come in and teach. As they've changed, I've realized, wow, I can really play a crucial role in helping others become comfortable, not just me going in and teaching, but how do I help other people address this topic so there's more of us talking about it. And then that makes a real impact too. And it changes how people with disabilities are perceived. And that, so I'm really invested, and my journey has gone this way for personal and professional reasons. Um, and just like my journey, I had children while I was used a wheelchair, and had all of that kind of discrimination and messages sent my way. And I think just modeling for other people that people with disabilities live regular lives. They just happen to use wheelchairs or canes or plain language to learn or whatever it might be. But that people with disabilities are just like everyone else.
I think that's a really important thing to remember. It kind of ties into the my next and kind of final question I was going to ask you. If you could pick one piece of advice to share with our audience today, what would you say? What would it be?
Oh, do I have to pick just one?
I mean, no, but
Yeah. Okay. So I think the first one I think of is, as a culture, we tend to react around this topic of sexuality and healthy relationships. So I would say one of the bits of advice I give lots of people is respond, don't react. Just respond to a question or a behavior or anything. Just respond and not treat it like this anxiety producing topic. Like it's a normal, healthy part of people's lives. And to try to really have that mindset. Like, of course, you're asking these questions. So I think that instead of like reacting to something, so I think that's a bit of wisdom or advice I would give people. And then I think just the things I've sort of said before is that, if you have this belief that if we talk about it, it gives people ideas, that's incorrect. If we talk about it, this gives people information that helps them make choices that are right for them. It doesn't give them ideas. It doesn't make them more risky. It gives them power and protection too. So I think those are kind of my two biggies.
I think it's really good advice, especially the idea as a young person. I think a lot of education around sexuality, at least for me growing up, was abstinence, right? If we don't do anything, nothing can happen. But that's really, especially in my line of work, that's not always what happens. Sometimes you don't have a choice whether or not you're introduced kind of into this world of sexuality. And so I think
Mhm.
education as prevention and also education as protection is something that we're working on using more. And I'm
Mhm.
excited to see where that kind of goes as we grow and change as a society. But I'm very impressed consistently by the work that you do. I get your emails with the updates and I read every one.
Oh, that's
But it's
great.
it's nice to know that there's always an answer somewhere. Even if we haven't found it yet, we're working to find it. I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, so thank you very much for joining us today. Where
Yes.
can people find you if they're interested in learning more about Elevatus?
Yeah, so I have a website. So it's Elevatus, which is Elevatus. So it's Elevatus, training.com. And there's all the, trainings and materials that we've developed, but also there's a free resource page with lots of great articles and lessons and videos you can show and teach. So lots of teaching tools as well. Um, and we also have a free workshop we offer every month if someone wants to just come on, sign up for it. And it's an hour long, and we talk about healthy boundaries and sexuality. And um, so I think that's my advice. Go to the website, come to a workshop, look at the resource page, and reach out if you have any specific questions or concerns or anything.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Catherine, for joining us today. Once again, Catherine McLaughlin from Elevatus, and I am your host, Grace McCormick. Make sure you're following Safe Journeys at safe.journeys on Instagram and Facebook, as well as our podcast page at safer.journeys.podcast. That's all for now. I'll see you 2 weeks from today, next Monday, the Monday after next, actually. Until then, I'm Grace McCormick, and I hope you have a safe journey wherever you're going. Bye bye.